Barbara McQuaid, who's now an NBC News legal analyst. So Ken, today's news from the special counsel, not unexpected,
right.
But to be clear, this is still very historic. Explain why.
It's momentous, and it's going to cause a lot of thinking about what just happened over the last 2 years. So Jack Smith had to do this. He's an employee of the Justice Department, and as soon as Donald Trump was elected president, Jack Smith went to the Office of Legal Counsel and said, hey, does our policy of not indicting and prosecuting a sitting president apply in this instance before he even takes office? And they came back and they said, yes, we think it does. And so he had no choice but to dismiss these charges against Donald Trump. He is saying in the filing, though, that he stands behind the prosecution. They are dismissed with prejudice, which doesn't mean all that much because the likelihood of these charges being refiled seems quite limited, and there is a 5-year statute of limitations for many of these charges. But still, it's a big day. It's going to raise a lot of questions about, for example, why didn't this prosecution happen earlier? What would history have been different had that happened?
It doesn't mean, though, that the special counsel's work ends today, right? He can still issue a final report. He can still kind of put out all of his evidence together in a neat package for us to read, right?
He's required by regulation to issue a final report to the Attorney General, who is likely to make that public. But in this case, we are led to believe there's not going to be all that much in a report that we haven't already seen in the public record. There's been so much evidence put out in both of these cases, and there isn't time for like an intelligence agency review of additional things that he might want to put out there. So realistically, we may not learn that much new from a report, but there will probably be some strong language about why the prosecutor brought these cases.
All right, so Barbara, let's turn to you now. Obviously, the special counsel did not concede that Donald Trump was not guilty. He went to great pains to make that point, just that the cases against him could not proceed. Were you surprised at the language that he used in these filings?
No, I'm not surprised that he chose to dismiss the case, because what I think he wanted to do was to end the case on his own terms. If he files today, he can dismiss it without prejudice. That means the case can be brought again. His other option really was to let it play out and have Donald Trump's next attorney general or the acting attorney general on January 21st dismiss the case, and no doubt would have done so with prejudice, meaning it could not be brought again. There could even have been filings in the public docket saying things like it was brought for malicious reasons, it was a case of prosecutorial misconduct. They would have had that opening to do that. And so I think in this way, they can control the narrative. They can say they stand behind the case on the merits. And if there is an appetite for it, there probably will not be, but there is the possibility of refiling these charges in 2029. Of course, they'd have to win the argument that during the 4 years that Donald Trump was president, the statute of limitations was told. But I think that would be consistent with this idea that a sitting president cannot defend himself from criminal charges.
And Barbara, Ken makes the point that this final report probably won't tell us a lot of new information, given that so much of it has been out there in the public sphere. But this is his last chance to lay out the case against Trump, and also his first chance to defend himself if Trump's Department of Justice does come after him. What kind of language do you think he'll use in that report?
Yeah, I would expect to see a report. You never know what you might see. You don't know what you don't know. So it is possible that we'll see additional facts that have not previously been revealed. But I think we will see a description of why this case was important, why it mattered to the national security of the United States. And I don't think they care much about defending themselves. I don't think there's any evidence that they've engaged in any sort of misconduct. But to explain for history why this case was filed and why it remains important.
And Ken, of course, in the classified documents case, there were co-defendants. Are they off the hook now, too, or does that case move forward?
For now, they are not, because, remember, that case had been dismissed by the judge, but that dismissal is on appeal, because it was on the legal issue of whether the DOJ complied with the law and how it appointed special counsel. So the DOJ is continuing to litigate that appeal, and it's continuing to prosecute the case against those co-defendants. Whether that's only to keep the thing in the appeals process or not remains to be seen, or whether they do continue the prosecution.
And Barbara, what is your take on how the courts will handle this appeal? Is this something? Is this an opportunity? Can the special counsel still win that appeal at this point?
I think so. And remember, the appeal in the documents case is really about the constitutionality of the special counsel appointment. I think most people would agree that that is a constitutional appointment. And so we could get a ruling, at least from the 11th Circuit, on that issue. before perhaps we see the new Justice Department pull the plug on the case. And that would be important to at least get rid of this district court decision that is now pending. That is kind of the final take in this case, that the special counsel regs were unconstitutional. So to get that overturned, I think, could be important. I also think it's important to keep that case going. My guess is that the Justice Department will dismiss the case with regard to the other two defendants. But the idea that this too is dismissed without prejudice as to Donald Trump means that it is theoretically still alive. My guess is Donald Trump may try to pardon himself from both of these cases, but let's make him do that, I suppose, is some of the thinking of the Justice Department, and then perhaps it can be challenged down the road.
And Barbara thinks, Ken, that the special counsel doesn't have anything to worry about from a legal perspective, but that's not perhaps going to stop the incoming Justice Department for at least making something out of this, right? And we have reporting over the weekend about some of the language that Pam Bondi, the potential incoming Attorney General, has said about this. I mean, how could this play itself out?
It really does seem likely that we'll see a special counsel appointed to investigate the investigators here, just the way there was one in the first Trump administration, John Durham, and he spent years poking around dark corners and came up with very few cases. But look, the Republicans have been making this charge for months and years that the DOJ has been weaponized, that this case was political. If you're going to make that charge, you should come up with evidence. And I've been covering these investigations for 2 years. I've not seen any credible evidence that political appointees interfered or that Jack Smith or his team did anything inappropriate. And so I don't think they have any legal exposure at all. But every memo they wrote, every text message they sent will be open to the next administration and any special counsel or prosecutor that wants to look at it.
And let's talk about the gravity of that, right? Maybe they won't be convicted of any crime, but they're going to be forced to get lawyers. Some of this laundry could be aired publicly. I mean, this could be very inconvenient for members of this team. Inconvenient
and painful and financially costly. And for the career prosecutors who want to go back to their old jobs in the Justice Department, they're in limbo right now. The idea that they're going to be able to work as normal in a Trump Justice Department, I think, is very much up in the air.
And Donald Trump, Ken, impeached by the House, later indicted for trying to overthrow the results of the 2020 election. Police officers, even one of Trump's own supporters, died as a result of that effort. Hundreds of Trump supporters are now in prison as a result of it as well. Now Donald Trump's about to take office again, having won the 2024 election. He won the popular vote as well. I mean, is there concern at the Justice Department right now about what this president-elect could be capable of after winning this election, given everything that we saw play out over the last 4 years?
Well, first of all, there's great sadness that the lesson of Watergate, which is that no one is above the law and that when presidents commit crimes, they're held accountable, that seems to have gone out the window, at least for half the American public. But yes, the DOJ is absolutely very concerned about all these promises to prosecute the prosecutors and go after the alleged weaponization for all the reasons we just discussed. Whether they prosecute anybody, they can make people's lives miserable, and they're concerned about people getting fired and losing their jobs and being asked to take action that they don't believe is ethical.
Yeah, and Barbara, your take on that as well. What could be the long-term impact of how this all played out?
Well, to fire somebody who is a career prosecutor is not so easily done. You can't just say, I don't like you, and you're gone. There are civil service protections for that. So I don't think it's quite as easy, perhaps, as some politicians think it is to clean house at the Department of Justice. But I do worry about the chilling effect this could have on recruiting of new people who might want to serve as prosecutors in the Justice Department, or others who might be inclined to leave, good people who've been there for their entire careers. It's important to have institutional knowledge and experience in addition to talent in prosecuting cases, and I worry that people who are good people may see that the grass appears greener outside of government for the next 4 years.
Okay. Ken and Barbara, thank you both. We appreciate it. Let's turn now to the Trump transition, which has now shifted from speculation to confirmation, with the president-elect completing his picks for his cabinet, assembling a team of ideological rivals and loyalists, naming a hedge fund executive, a protege of a Democratic megadonor, George Soros, to lead the Treasury Department. His pick to run the Labor Department is a centrist who backed legislation making it easier for unions to organize. And he picked a former liberal Democrat who supports abortion rights to lead his Department of Health and Human Services. These are people that he's handpicked to implement what he describes as a conservative agenda. He's also tapped ardent loyalists who have vowed to carry out his agenda, including a budget director who served in the first Trump administration and co-authored the ultra-conservative think tank blueprint called Project 2025. Joining me now is Garrett Hake. He's been covering the Trump transition for NBC News. Also with me, NBC News senior business correspondent Christine Romans. So, Garrett, let's start with you. I mean, this cabinet does seem to be a bit all over the place ideologically. What do we make of it?
Well, I think it's part of the point, and this is the way that Donald Trump has always operated, whether it was in politics or as a private citizen. He likes to have competing factions around him, different teams, different ideas. He likes to let them fight it out, basically, and then make the decisions himself. Sometimes he thinks that creates better results. From the outside, it can also appear to create chaos, which is what we saw at many times during his first administrations. But I think you also see different factions within the Republican Party being served by different elements of these picks. There are much more traditional hawks. There are people who proved themselves, I think, in Trump's view during the first administration. Then there's some of these people who are kind of newer to the Trump coalition. I'm thinking of people like Tulsi Gabbard or RFK Jr., who were Democrats 4 years ago and are now finding themselves part of the MAGA crew. We will see who ultimately gets across the finish line and how well these groups work together. But it's not unusual to have a team of rivals in a cabinet. And it's certainly not unusual for Trump to surround himself with people who disagree with one another, as long as they ultimately back him. I think it's the way he looks at it.
We think back to 8 years ago when he even was surprised himself that he won the presidency and kind of cobbled together a cabinet without much experience there. He's now had basically 4 years to think about this cabinet, right? Is that one of the big differences between what we saw now and in 2017?
I suppose, although I don't think we're seeing a much different process now post-election as we would have seen otherwise. By that I mean, I don't think he was sitting around in 21 and 22 saying, who will I want in my administration if I come back? He's also can be something of a superstitious person, and so didn't want to measure the drapes before he was back in the White House. But I do think he understands that personnel was a problem in his first administration. Maybe not in the way that you and I would think of it, but for example, someone like Jeff Sessions, he saw as an issue, someone who wasn't sufficiently loyal in that AG job. I think you can see the through line from that pick to Matt Gaetz's selection pretty clearly. It's certainly probably to a lesser degree with Pam Bondi's, but the same theme applies here. So he's looking at different categories of people when he's making his picks now, but I think that's a different Trump than in 2016, 2017, certainly.
And speaking of Matt Gaetz, he's not, of course, up for the Attorney General job anymore. Seemed pretty clear.
I've heard, yes.
He wasn't going to get the votes. So that now raises questions about the other controversial picks, right? Is the transition team worried that there's another one of these picks that perhaps could meet the same fate that Gaetz has?
I think they understand the math pretty clearly here and the unlikelihood that they will get much Democratic support from many of these picks. And I think there's some who probably will. Lori Chavez-DeRemer, for example, for Labor Secretary, is probably going to pick up some Democratic votes. Marco Rubio could pick up 24 Democratic votes for all I know. But if you're looking at somebody like a Pete Hegseth, for example, who I know you were covering when he was on the Hill late last week, I think is somebody who they see is going to be problematic. Tulsi Gabbard, I think they perhaps are overly optimistic will get Democratic votes. Having been a former Democrat, I think that's a misread by the Trump team. So I do think there's at least a couple other picks who could have challenges. But I think it's important to understand that if they're going to lose Republican votes, it's more likely they're going to lose them on personal characteristics, by which I mean the allegations against Pete Hegseth, which he has denied, are probably more important to him not getting confirmed than would be anything he said about the Defense Department. Senators, I think, are very skeptical about breaking from Trump on policy issues, having just spent the last several weeks crowing about his mandate and theirs.
Yeah. Let's talk now about Russell Vought, who is probably not a household name by any stretch of the imagination, but he's the pick for OMB director. That is a very powerful position within the White House. And he is, of course, one of the architects of Project 2025, which Trump claimed he knew nothing about. What should we know about him?
Well, look, the OMB, first of all, is much more powerful than people realize. Not just the organization that determines whether we in the Washington area get snow days, which is all what they do, but they're kind of the lubricant for how all the other executive agencies work. And so Russell Vought, as head of OMB, would have a little bit of say and a little bit of control in how every other executive department implements their workflow, how their workforce operates. And I think the area in which he could be most influential and has most ties to Project 2025 is this effort that Trump has sort of flirted with, talked about, some in his orbit have discussed, trying to reclassify some federal workers, much like the discussion you were just having about these federal prosecutors, trying to make more people who work within the federal government currently as civil servants, turn them into political appointees, which would have the net effect of making them easier to fire and for Trump to make it easier to hire their replacements. So you could see a shift in the government apparatus to being more kind of pro-Trump broadly rather than the career civil service structure that we have in place now. Vought could be a key player in that, but he won't be able to do that alone.
Yeah, and of course, if they were to do that, there's a chance they don't even fill some of those jobs.
That's right.
If they're looking to save money. All right, Garrett, thank you so much for that. Let's now talk about Treasury, and that's where we bring in Christine Romans. Tell us about this pick for Treasury, Scott Bessent. What should we know about it?
This was a name we heard early on in the process, and then there was a real, as you know, a back and forth. One of my sources close to the transition called it a bouncing ball among names. And then back to Scott Bessent. He is a hedge fund manager. He has made billions of dollars for investors. He is someone who has made some pretty key calls, macro strategy calls over the years, where he sees the whole global picture and puts money, bets for or against a direction in the global economy. And he has done very, very well doing that here. So he's someone that is not seen as a flamethrower. He's seen someone who he's a grown-up, and he's not somebody who's breaking conventional rules like some of these other picks are.
But he is, Christine, which would probably be very much of a surprise to people who pay attention to this, a protege of George Soros, of all people, who is somewhat of a boogeyman for Republicans. Is there any surprise that Trump would pick a Treasury Secretary with such close ties to one of their biggest foes?
Yeah, let's remember George Soros is like Republican kryptonite or conservative kryptonite. And here's somebody who worked alongside him. In fact, when George Soros was making his huge bets against the British pound, and when he was making investments around Japan, it was Scott Bessent who was doing the research and the advising and was right there next to him. He's worked for other very, very well-known and powerful investors as well. But that is a funny kind of wrinkle in the resume, considering Donald Trump and his war on woke and war on what he thinks is a George Soros-fueled left.
Not that this is the only metric that we should concern ourselves with, but it is important. The markets seem happy with this potential pick. Why?
Record high for the Dow again here today. Look, he is someone who Wall Street, at least now, is hoping will go quickly with tax cuts and slowly and more measured with tariffs. And why is that important? Because the tariffs could be very, very disruptive to Wall Street, to global business, and that's going to have to be something that is really an international art of the deal, and they're hoping that Scott Bessent is the guy with his background that'll be able to talk to Donald Trump behind the scenes and be a little bit of a shock absorber if necessary on the tariff strategy. At the same time, he has said that he wants to go get these tax cuts made permanent. He'd like to have more tax cuts, no taxes on Social Security, on overtime, on tipped wages. All of that begs the question, if he also is sort of has fiscal discipline, then how are you going to pay for that, Ryan? So that's what Wall Street's happy today, but they're going to be the pay-fors that'll be the next step of this process.
And do they view him somewhat as a check on the Trump agenda, or at least able to focus Trump a little bit more to meet their concerns?
It's unclear. They're putting him more in a moderate bucket, a non-flamethrower bucket, which is something that they're pleased with. I mean, he is not, and Howard Lutnick, who's now over the Commerce Department. By the way, there are those who are already starting to game out. Well, if commerce is sort of the tip of the spear for tariff strategy, and the strategy comes from the White House and Treasury, could there be potential conflict down the road with Scott Bessent and Howard Lutnick? I think those are parlor games that I'm not ready to get to play yet. I just want to live in today. And for today, the markets are saying quick on tax cuts, slower on tariffs, steady as she goes. I mean, Elon Musk actually said he's business as usual, that he shouldn't be picked as a Treasury Secretary. Wall Street says business as usual. Well, the S&P is up 91% over the past 5 years, so they'll take business as usual.